Economy and International Affairs. Today, the Department of International Relations and International Laboratory and World Order Studies and the New Regionalism, in cooperation with the School of Oriental Studies of the National Research University High School of Economics, is holding another joint session of Eurasian Online Seminar and China Seminar. Today, we are happy to introduce you all our US expert on European, Eurasian, and East Asian security, Dr. Richard Weitz. The topic of his talk is, how could the US elections impact Russian-Chinese-US relations? Richard Weitz is a senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at Hudson Institute. His current research includes regional security developments related to Europe, Eurasia, East Asia, as well as US foreign and defense policies. Before joining Hudson in 2005, Dr. Weitz worked for shorter terms for other research institutes and the US Department of Defense, where he received an award for excellence from Office of the Secretary of Defense. Dr. Weitz is a graduate of Harvard University, Ph.D. in Political Science, Oxford University, M.Phil in Politics, the London School of Economics, M.Sc in International Relations, and Harvard College, a bachelor's degree with highest honors in government, where he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, which is the oldest academic honor society in the United States. So Dr. Weitz seems to have gathered all the best universities there. He's also proficient in Russian, French, and German. Dr. Weitz has authored or edited several books and monographs, including Assessing the Collective Security Treaty Organization, 2018, Promoting US-Indian Defense Cooperation, 2017, Enhancing the Georgia-US Security Partnership, 2016, China and Afghanistan after the NATO withdrawal, 2015, Reforming US Export Controls Reforms, 2015, and we're going to have to stop here, even though there are many more books, because we've agreed that we'll only name the most recent ones. You can all check the emails anyway. It's all the books are there. He also authored 2 volumes of National Security Case Studies, Project on National Security Reform, 2012 and 2008. Dr. Weitz has also extensively published in such journals as Survival, Jane's Intelligence Review, Jane's Islamic Affairs Analyst, The Washington Quarterly, The National Interest, NATO Review, Global Asia, Arms Control Today, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Defense Concept, Pacific Focus, ASAN Forum, Journal of Defense Studies, and so forth. And Richard also mentioned that he is a member of Valdai Club. Now, we are very happy today to have you here. The seminar has the usual format. To those of you who are not familiar with it, if you'd like to ask a question, we're going to have a Q&A session after about 45 minutes or so. If you'd like to do so, please write down your name in the chat and your question if you'd like, and we'll call you out. We hope the discussion will be very extensive and prolific. So, Richard, we look forward to what you have to say. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you for allowing me to participate in the program. It's always, I'm always eager to engage with Russian experts and colleagues on these important issues. What I'll do is I'll lay out some general comments on what looks to be President Biden's foreign policy outlook, his themes. I'll discuss how this fits into Russia, China, US relations, that triangle. I'll include some specific cases on geographic and functional issues I think could be important, and then assess what conclusions may be possible. I do need to make a couple of caveats though. One, I don't have any insider information. I don't have close contacts with the Biden team. So it's based on what I picked up from news media and from hearing their experts or people affiliated with the campaign over the years and some of their policy papers to get an assessment of what they might do. And of course, one of the first things that any new administration does in the US is they launch these lengthy policy reviews that will take months to review options and so on. So it could be that what they've been saying during the campaign, what they've said in their academic and think tank lives will not necessarily reflect their policies. Of course, we also need to recall what Comrade Stalin said about cadres decide everything. So it depends a lot on who will be the political appointees that a president-elect Biden will appoint. In the U.S. system, these are several thousand possible political appointees, and they go up to the highest levels, including the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and head of the other key agencies that deal with national security and foreign policy. I would think that Biden will delegate some policy areas that are not, he doesn't consider a priority, to be made by his political appointees, while retaining close oversight over a few select areas that are most important to him and his team. Russia may fall into either category. We can discuss that. And then there's also an uncertainty over what role Vice President Harris will play. Often the Vice President plays a very important role in Russia-U.S. relations. We, of course, all remember the Chairman Commission and other variants since then. She has general interest in foreign policy. She's on the Intelligence Committee. But she's not like Joe Biden, who's been serving for decades as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee and then as vice president. So her track record in foreign affairs is a bit less known. And I also want to emphasize, though, that I hope to use this mechanism as a conversation. I'm going to throw out my initial thoughts and ideas, but I really want to hear people's not only questions but comments, since I'd be curious to know what assessments our colleagues calling in might have. And I'm also going to not spend too much attention on some of the topics I thought were well covered in the previous seminar by Dmitry Suslov. He spent a lot of time talking about some of the domestic sources of U.S. foreign policy, the political polarization, and so on. I can't really add anything to that, so I'll focus more on the external behavior of the three countries. Now, during the election campaign, the vice president and his team prudently didn't give much detail on their foreign policy. But as I mentioned, he has extensive experience serving in office in the Congress and vice presidency, so he does have there's a lot of indication of how he reaches decisions, what his past preferences have been. He's got some think tanks and advisors that have more clearly articulated their views that we may think will be followed. That said, the foreign policies really didn't play much of an impact in the elections. The Russiagate question didn't have much of an impact in 2016 in voters' minds, and then this year didn't appear to as well. The China flu thesis that President Trump was pushing also didn't resonate a lot in the public's mind. I mean, I think that the 4 years of the Trump administration have clearly turned U.S. opinion more negative towards China overall, but didn't really seem to affect the electoral outcome. Those people who supported President Trump for other reasons accepted his views on China, and those who opposed him did not. So, in terms of Vice President-elect Biden's way of dealing with decisions, he tends to be a centrist Democrat. He likes to seek compromise. He relies a lot on expert advice from former officials, think tank community, less from business people, and so on. So you probably will see a lot of think tank people go into government and rely more on bureaucratic advice, as well as the appointed officials. Initially, he's almost certainly going to focus on domestic policy issues, particularly the question of how to manage the COVID pandemic, which is just turning into a disaster here, and the question of economic recovery, and how do you ideally use the opportunity to increase federal spending to develop a stronger, more competitive economy long term. But it's possible, since it looks like the Senate will remain under Republican hands, that this deadlock in Congress is going to frustrate a lot of his domestic agenda, and that will lead him, like previous presidents, to turn more towards foreign policy, where a president typically has more leeway, particularly for pursuing non-treaty executive agreements and launching diplomatic initiatives, low-funded projects. So I suspect that he will soon rejoin the WHO, resume funding of the organization, rejoin the climate agreement, and so on. The other initial effects I think he'll take, because he can do these by executive decision, is to roll back some of the immigration and refugee restrictions. His platform at least calls for more substantial increase in allowing immigrants and refugees to come to the US. This obviously depends a bit on the global course of the pandemic, but as soon as that's hopefully under control, then I think you'll see a return to the kind of refugee and immigration policies that have characterized previous administrations before the current one. They're going to spend a lot of time rewriting some key national security documents, above all the national security strategy, national defense strategy, and so on. The ones that were issued under the Trump administration had their focus was somewhat this American first ideology of the president, but they also were very reflective of the think tank consensus, and it looked like they were written by think tanks among some conservative groups of think tanks and experts about the role of the US in the world, the main threats, main appropriate strategy. There was more emphasis on economics and energy in these documents than previously, but generally comprehensive, and they will probably scrub them and put in their own perspective. And from then, they'll go ahead and start deriving the derivative documents that apply to each of the agencies and policy areas. Many of these are mandated by Congress, and there's a specific timeline, so that will consume a lot of energy, but then should provide a good guidance for general approach to international affairs. I think the priority initially will be more on China than Russia, more on economics, including energy and climate, than security. As was discussed last week, there's a general reluctance to engage in large-scale military interventions or regime change unless, except maybe, unless forced to by events. If there's something like Belarus that I think they will, invariably side with the protesters if it's an authoritarian regime, but I don't think they're going to go out and really try and replace governments where there's not a domestic basis of support. Climate change is a clear priority for this team. I think they'll make some progress just by rejoining the Paris Agreement, by they're making greater diplomatic efforts. We saw that in a previous administration, Secretary Kerry spent a lot of time lobbying other countries to adopt stricter energy reduction emission commitments and working towards the Paris Agreement. And certainly that will be a priority for whoever's going to be the next Secretary of State. But at home, there's going to be resistance, particularly among the Republicans, to spending a lot of money on a major green energy program or substantial foreign aid. So I think it'll be a lot of lobbying other countries to take standards and maybe focus on a couple targeted programs at home. With regard to Europe, I think they're going to be a bit cross-pressured. I think, on the one hand, they want to heal some of the divisions in the alliance, but some of the initiatives launched by the Trump administration, I think they're going to continue. I think Nord Stream question might be an early indicator. They don't favor Nord Stream 2 for the reasons that have been discussed in some of your earlier seminars, but they don't really want to get in a fight with the Germans either. The current proposals in Congress are to sanction technical and certification companies rather than German officials. So they may stick with that compromise. They'll, in principle, be more open to NATO enlargement, but in practice, there's still a lot of resistance to that in certain countries in Europe. So I don't know if, I don't anticipate any new members anytime soon. They will probably reverse the US troop withdrawal from Germany that's planned, keep the Africa command there. I'm not sure what they'll do about Poland, which is supposed to receive 1,000 new forces. They may let that transition go ahead, or they may want to leverage that for changes in Polish domestic policy that they're uncomfortable with. The NATO has already started a strategic reflection process for the year 2030. Focusing on enhancing our alliance unity. So I think that will be a major effort they want to engage in. I think, as I said, they want to overcome some of the friction that they've seen in the alliance in recent years. I think their support for the EU will be stronger, though it's not clear to me with what effect. I mean, I think with, with the British out and the EU having their own strong leaders in France and Germany for now, although we'll soon have elections, I think the US will just simply support what the EU does, not try and denigrate or challenge it in public. I think that Europe will continue to support the US regarding China. I think the Trump administration made a lot of progress in swinging the European leaders behind the US view on 5G, on INF missiles, and globally, on getting China involved in arms control and criticisms of various Chinese policies. I think, Beijing's behavior sort of contributed to that. There are certain ambassadors in China, in Europe, that have taken a very heavy-handed approach towards their countries that they're working in, criticizing them, for example, for supporting various human rights policies. So I think they won't see a major break between Europe and the US regarding China. With regard to Belarus, I think they will generally put a lot of pressure on the Lukashenko government to deal with the resistance, but perhaps also try and provide support for those political leaders that are now leaving and spending, as far as we can tell, moving indefinitely to neighboring countries. They're, of course, going to be cross-pressured. They want to improve the internal situation, in their view, in Belarus, but they don't want to drive the country too close to Moscow, since that would reduce the long-term prospects for US influence in the country. Black Sea, I think we'll see a continuation of the current strategy of augmenting the US and NATO resources, a lot of more frequent military presence, and that's supported by most of the littoral states, so that seems to be fine. And I think that they will more explicitly talk about fortifying these countries against these, this hybrid subconventional threats by reducing corruption, promoting more civil rights, promoting transparency, and so on. And this idea is just to make these countries less vulnerable to Russian and Chinese influence. Looking to Asia, I think, there's the obvious question of Korea. They didn't think that the Trump administration's policies achieved much, despite his President Trump's bold policies trying to break with transition. I think they have the same ends, though: a non-nuclear Korea, no war in the peninsula, better ties between Korea and other countries, but the means might be different. I think they're going to listen more to the South Korean government. There'll be perhaps more cooperation with China and Russia on that. I think the focus is going to be less seeking a comprehensive final agreement and more on achieving an incremental step-by-step process. I worry a bit that the DPRK, North Korea, may try and test the US. They traditionally test new US leaders, so we may have to deal with a long-range missile launch or some kind of nuclear test, and just so they can gauge the reaction of the Trump team. They have made clear that there will be no more leadership summits unless there's a lot more detailed preparation and specific agreements worked out beforehand. and instead they'll just rely on empowered lower level officials to try and prepare the groundwork. I think the Trump administration was moving in the same way, though. And even if it had stayed in power, I think they were going to, they thought the summit process had, has reached its usefulness at this point. With respect to Russia, you're aware that there are divisions among U.S. experts and European countries over how much to try and improve relations. We've seen these competing letters in the U.S. of Russian experts, some saying, well, we should make an initiative and try and aim for limited improvements, where there's another letter saying it's pretty hopeless, we'll just have to button down for the long haul. There's no high-level Russian plan that I've been able to discern. For some incoming administrations, they have a major initiative about what kind of policies they want to pursue with Russia. There's the reset, for example, well known from the early years of the Obama administration. So this might mean that we'll see more focus on specific topics, functional issues, geographic issues. We've seen past efforts at reconciliation fail substantially. There was the post-Cold War reset, the post-9/11 reset, the Obama reset, the Trump reset. None of them really work. So, and I think there's a sense that nothing's changed, so nothing will work. It was interesting that we saw, for example, when the Obama-Biden team came in 2009, they felt that the relationship had deteriorated more than it should have, and they blamed some of the policies of the previous Bush administration, so they tried to repair that. And President Trump had the same view, feeling that the previous Obama administration had needlessly worsened relations more than they should have been, so they tried to repair that. There isn't that feeling now. There's a feeling that the relationship is bad and it's going to stay bad, and you can't really repair that situation, at least in the near term. I know that Dmitry Suslov last week mentioned that there's an animus between incoming President Biden and President Putin. I'm not sure on that. I don't know about Putin per se, but at least Biden, he didn't make Russia much of an issue during the elections. There are politicians in the US who do have an animus towards Putin. Someone like John McCain was quite clear. Biden, I don't think would interfere with his policies in a sense. I think they're more, the barriers to better relations are not personal. I think it's more structural. And so I'm not too concerned about whether the personal chemistry. I don't think they'll have one, but I don't think it's bad that they can't establish one, good relations, if we can deal with some of these other structural issues. During the election, whatever disinformation operations Russia did, they didn't stand out as much as in 2016. Primarily because this time a bunch of actors were engaged in this as well. So the US authorities have evidence that China, Iran, and other groups were trying to influence the outcome through various information operations. And there was, of course, incredible amount of disinformation in the US media and the US political system itself. So whatever Russia did didn't surpass the noise of this, the background noise level. So that shouldn't be much of an issue. I think the Republicans, if they do lose the presidency, aren't going to blame Russia. I think they may blame China. I've seen some initial efforts to lay out this argument that, with the spread of COVID, that hurt the U.S. economy, embarrassed the U.S. government, may have weakened support for President Trump. And there's, of course, if you think that the mail-in ballots were the problem that undermined some of the legitimacy of the U.S. electoral process, well, the reason we have all these mail-in ballots is that many people like me didn't feel like going to standing in line for hours and in polling lines to cast a vote because of the virus. So we just sent it all in mail. So that's why we have such record numbers of mail-in ballots. So you could, depending on your views, if you're really hostile with China, you could direct your blame on China for this. So we haven't seen that yet so far. The focus has been internal disagreements. I mean, I think President Trump's latest attribution of blame is to Fox News and other media for not supporting him. And he said he might set up his own competing conservative channel, which will be interesting. Biden, since he is not going to be hobbled by accusations of being pro-Russian, so in theory, he has more freedom to promote policies without having to worry about that. But there's still many in Congress and in allied governments that have a hard line towards Russia. So even, I think, if he wanted to improve relations with Russia through some bold initiative, he would meet resistance in Congress and in the allies to that effort. They will undertake a comprehensive review of the sanctions regime. I think they're going to try and look at what's been working, what not. They call for smart sanctions. This won't necessarily mean a lot of repeal of the existing sanctions. It's more trying to optimize them. There is a general view among some of these experts that the sanctions have been overused for too many sanctions on issues that are not of vital importance. And this sort of weakens some of the potential for sanctions being valuable in the future, driving Russia and China and others to avoid using the dollar and so on. I don't anticipate any major new sanctions, especially sanctions on US allies, which I thought were counterproductive. Maybe a more rigorous application of existing ones on Turkey, perhaps Russia. The focus is going to, one of the focus I do see is they'll focus on anti-corruption issues embedded in the Global Magnitsky Act, and they may use that to target Russia, China, and other countries. But unless I think Russia does something really bad in their view, I'm not anticipating major new sanctions. My impression, although people I'm interested in their views, is the Russian government, at least President Putin, from what he said, seems to accept that these sanctions will remain here for a while, and it's something Russia can deal with through circumvention, compensation, or simply just being able to tolerate them, that they've taken whatever hits they had early and are now being able to protect themselves better. Democracy promotion and human rights will become more important for the Biden team, but they've got a lot of, they don't have much room to maneuver in Russia and Eurasia. I think they've got a fait accompli with the Russian political transition, with adoption of a new constitution. You have a fait accompli in Belarus, in South Caucasus, even in Syria. There's not much at this point the U.S. can do to change the outcomes we're seeing. Central Asia does not look to be a priority, so they'll probably see continued U.S. indifference to the Moscow-dominated Eurasian institutions, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, Eurasian Economic Union, and so on. You may see a renewed focus on Ukraine. As you know, in the U.S., the impeachment hearings and so on were preoccupied and then removed many of the key players the U.S. government had assigned to dealing with the Ukraine issue. So it's been a bit of an abeyance since then. So there may be a new U.S. effort on Ukraine. And there'll be a focus on perhaps on counterterrorism with the president. The Russian government has acknowledged that the U.S. has helped expose some terrorist plots in St. Petersburg. I think that will continue. But it's pretty much the agenda that we've had for decades, sort of this Cold War agenda of arms control, which I'll discuss later, regional security issues, Korea, Iran, Ukraine. And you know, and then not too much economics, not too much beyond that. With respect to China, we've seen a big change over the previous Obama, Biden, or Clinton experience when we had Democrats in power. Like US policy towards Russia, right now, you really don't have a strong group lobbying for better relations with China as you did in the past. The Chinese policies have alienated the US business community with many of their policies. Even farmers tended to vote for Trump because they wanted to change Chinese trade practices. Liberals, of course, are focusing on a lot of the human rights violations we've seen in China and Hong Kong and Xinjiang and so on. And then Trump, constant years of bashing China has had some impact. If you look at the polls, China's popularity in the US has plummeted. I do think, though, that they'll perhaps tone down the ideological rhetoric that one of the Trump team's innovations was to focus a lot on the Chinese Communist Party as the problem. And I think some of the Democratic leadership worries that this sort of implies that China has to change its regime to be able to have a better relationship with the US. And so I don't think they see that as needed for some issues. So I think they're going to tone down the ideological conflict. But certainly promotion on human rights and democracy in general, as well as defense of the global liberal international order and norms and so on that you often see in their presentations. The confrontational China will, I think, become more multilateral. I think the US is going to compete more vigorously in the UN and WHO for leadership with Chinese candidates. You'll see effort to revive regional institutions. A lot of focus now on what they're going to do with the former Trans-Pacific Partnership. Do they resurrect it? Do they change it? How? Support for the Quad, which, as you know, involves India, Japan, Australia, and the US. They're talking about creating some new ones, the most popular one being what they call the D10, Democracies 10. This is the G7 plus 3 major democracies in Asia: Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Taiwan, I'm not sure about. The Trump administration broke a lot of red lines in terms of arms sales, high-level official visits, and so on. I'm not sure they're going to continue along this line. They may want to focus on Taiwan's role in global health and democracy promotion rather than on the military and diplomatic equation directly. I think they're going to make a big push for Korea-Japan reconciliation. I think they worry that it hadn't received sufficient attention in the previous administration. Likewise, a lot of focus on East Asian institutions, the East Asia Summit, APEC. They'll start sending people to show up, whether virtually or in person, because they felt that the previous leadership hadn't spent enough attention to these Southeast Asian countries, and they want to raise the profile. They may take a pause in some of the military initiatives the U.S. has towards Asia, particularly plans to put INF range missiles around China, since countries that might host them don't really want to host them. So I'm not sure if they want to fight with them yet on this issue, but it sort of depends on how China responds as well. Economics, there'll be less emphasis on this unfair trade of alleged US allies and others, less emphasis on tariffs. The Trump administration's efforts to decouple the China-US economy was only narrowly successful. So you saw it with some internet apps, some other areas. But a lot of US companies are still heavily invested in China. I think it's kind of obvious why. The Chinese economy is doing better than anywhere else for any large economy. So that's you want to maintain your business foothold there. I think that they will continue putting regulations, restrictions on Chinese apps or companies they're concerned with, but it will be, I think, less ad hoc, one country after another. This month it's Huawei, next month it's something else. I think they'll try and focus more on categories and policies. So They're going to want enhanced data protection, transparency, and so on, of what happens to information Chinese companies garner from the US entities. But the big difference will be more focused on domestic reform. They really want to boost US innovation, manufacturing, human resource development, a lot of support in Congress for an explicit innovation industrial policy to boost the US innovations ecosystem, spend more on R&D, spend more on education. And their hope is just to make the US economy more competitive for emerging world we're dealing with, new emerging technologies and so on. Oh, well, so how does this all relate to Russia and China? Well, I mean, it's clear where we are now that the Russia-China relationship is better than it's ever been. Certainly the relationship has improved and gone further than many analysts, including myself, had thought. China is Russia's most important economic partner under President Xi. We see a lot of harmonious policy statements. I mean, I think that they're much more similar in what the two leaders say about the world. But it varies a bit by time, region, functional area. So in my view, and I'm interested people think about this, you see good cooperation in the defense area and the three baskets of arms sales, exercises, and regional security issues. You see cooperation in some international institutions like the UN, cooperation in global messaging, what their worldviews are in terms of their arms control stances, energy, and particularly in Central and Northeast Asia. You're seeing emerging areas of cooperation in the Arctic and outer space, but in some areas, Europe, Africa, Middle East, Western Hemisphere, humanitarian issues and economics beyond energy, still pretty weak. I mean, they're not in conflict in these areas, but there's not much policy coordination. I have more detail in each of these areas, but I'm going to skip over them in the interest of time, but happy to come back to them. In a way, the relationship is strong for several reasons, and I don't think the US elections are going to change that. One, you've got this general geopolitical equipoise in which, unlike in the past, neither Russia nor China is the dominant player in the relationship. It's true, China has risen a lot economically, but Russia still has important military and diplomatic assets. You've seen some shifts even in recent years. So the 2014 crisis gave China a bit of an advantage since all those Western sanctions on Russia made Moscow more interested in acquiring Chinese investment and cooperation. And you saw Russia, for example, selling more advanced weapons to China in response. Then when President Trump was elected, I just recall the Valdivia I came to right before that, when it was clear what might happen. There was a lot of sense that finally Russia's going to find itself in the key pivot on the China. It can pivot in the triangle. It can use the better relations proposed by President Trump to leverage concessions from China and the US and try and play them off each other to the benefit. But we know that didn't turn out for reasons that we all understand, the domestic challenges to that policy in the US and allies. Now you've got COVID and Biden sort of swinging the advantage slightly to China. With China's economy recovering more rapidly than others, I think that's just going to increase Russian and other countries' dependence on maintaining good ties with China. So it's a pretty robust relationship. Now, there are the sources of strength in the relationship. It's partly due to opposition to the US, but also for mutual security concerns, converging economic interests, and other shared interests. I was going to go into the Arctic example, but I'll skip that over in case people want to ask. But I think you're seeing Russia accept, you've seen both Russia accept China as a legitimate Arctic actor initially because they wanted to help, particularly developing some of the natural resources of the Arctic. But now I think a lot of focus is on the Northern Sea route and understanding that China might be the main actor there and being able to contribute main shipping. And the Chinese have rolled back some of their earlier claims to sovereignty or quasi-sovereignty in the region. but there's still things to be worked out regarding long-term division of spoils or division of resources, division activities there. Same regarding Korea. You've seen Russia and China have a similar line about no regime change, no rapid unification, no military action against North Korea, but not wanting North Korea to have nuclear weapons because of how it just strengthens the US military role in the area. The joint peace plan that they proposed, we've gotten a couple of the steps of the three. You've gotten a cessation of a major nuclear missile tests from North Koreans. You've got the US cutting back on its exercises with South Korea. You've now got these one-on-one leadership meetings between the North Koreans and the US and other major leaders, but we're still struggling how to then transition to the multilateral structure that was supposed to be the third phase of that. Russia and China are very good at managing areas where they disagree with. They're pretty good in compartmentalizing differences. So even though the Chinese don't like some of the policies that Moscow pursues towards India and Vietnam, and I think that the Russians are not overly enthusiastic about China's limited support for Russian policies in Eurasia, particularly Ukraine and Georgia. It's not anything that they think they can just, they're comfortable just agreeing to disagree. And you're seeing this in particular in the Japan case, where you still don't have full convergence on their territorial claims regarding Japan. You still have the legacy of the Cold War, where Beijing supported Tokyo and claims the Northern Territories, and Russia doesn't fully support China's claims to the East and South China Sea. So how does all this, what kind of position does this put the U.S.? There's not anything I see that the U.S. can do that could, break this partnership and pull them, one or both countries, back towards the U.S. Their opposition to U.S. policies is pretty comprehensive. It's not sectoral, tactical. So there's not one thing that the U.S. can do that would drive a wedge between this alignment. Both countries, I think, have the view that the U.S. needs to reverse the policies, not only of the previous U.S. administration, but many U.S. policies going back to the Cold War. It's sort of this position that, U.S. must admit its mistakes of the last few decades and correct its policies, and that's not going to happen. They're still going to remain alienated from some U.S. alliances, many U.S. policies. I've got some possible scenarios how the Russia-China relationship could worsen or strengthen over the long term, but I don't see any of these coming true in the near term. I think that the common interests between them are strong enough to hold them together, that there's not a clear divisive issue that could immediately cause them to split. So where are we going to end up with? Well, I think that great power competition will continue. We'll see probably more predictability in policies under President Biden, more focus on diplomatic engagement, interactions, particularly at the level of the cabinet secretaries and below. I think the U.S. ministries, departments will be more empowered to engage in regular dialogue. You'll see fewer contradictions between what the White House says and what the bureaucracies are doing. You're not going to see a major effort no more major wars or regime change unless something major happens, like a 9/11 attack or a terrorist attack. You'll maybe targets of opportunity. So if a protest breaks out in a country, the U.S. will naturally consider supporting the protesters. But I don't think the U.S. is going to actively seek to change any regimes. You're seeing a regularization of diplomacy, not diplomacy by tweets. I think that's over with for now. Possible areas of cooperation, Korea is a good one. I think that the long term, at least the immediate interests of all three countries are the same, ending North Korean nuclear tests and missile tests, and working out some kind of stable peace regime, eventual nuclearization. I think the Biden team will go more, as I said, for a step-by-step rather than comprehensive package. Iran, I'm not so sure. It depends a lot on what the Iranian government does. The Biden people said they are comfortable going back to the JCPOA framework, but some of the provisions have expired. So I think, we're going to have to figure out a new kind of agreement to address that. And I'm not sure how open the Iranian government is going to be to new negotiations. Climate change will probably be an area for cooperation. The Russian government, as President Putin said in his last speech in Valdai, is very concerned about what the implications are for Russia's permafrost and so on. China has always been concerned about that. Cooperation may extend to the Arctic. I think that the incoming team doesn't want to have the Arctic be a new arena for a global great war between Russia, China, and the US. So there may be more emphasis on scientific research cooperation. Global pandemics, that's the current one, some cooperation perhaps in distributing the vaccines that are being developed. Certainly want to prevent new global pandemics. Space exploration may become an area of cooperation just because of the costs. I mean, Russia's sort of the swing state here. In the past, the Russia-US cooperation was good, but Russia's been shifting in recent years more towards working with the Chinese. And, we've noticed some recent statements of lack of Russian government enthusiasm about participating in the revived US space program, particularly the lunar exploration. But their barriers to China-US cooperation are still substantial. So I'm not sure whether we're all going to have 3 separate programs or Russia will switch over to fully cooperate with China. Arms control, I think that we're going to see a quick acceptance, a new start, perhaps for the full 5-year extension is allowed for by the treaty. But this sort of just pushes the question down the road. I mean, it's going to expire, if not in 2021, then 2026. And so we're just going to have to deal with this question of how do you move a framework that was based on Moscow, Washington cooperation in limiting long-range strategic weapons to one where you have to get more countries involved and different types of weapon systems that could have effects equivalent to nuclear weapons, cyber, and artificial intelligence, and so on. Russia, as you know, just talking with experts on the call, many of the Russians were the pioneering pointing out the problem of not addressing additional countries, additional means, emerging technologies. And for a while, the US resisted. The Trump administration, though, switched, fully backs, including China, and some of these new technologies. But I think the Russian government has not been so openly supportive of that. I think they were happy if that the US pressured China to do this and not incur the cost of that pressure or try and break that resistance. But I think long term, that's something Russia and the US want to see, at least some limits on China's nuclear buildup. If it's not constrained, it's going to make arms control really difficult. The trilateral arms control is just really conceptually difficult. So maybe we can look for limits on number of missiles, nuclear, non-nuclear, more likely confidence building measures that don't require treaties, which are going to get hard to get through the Senate. Unilateral actions in parallel. So we'll need to work on this, trying to think about what might be possible going forward. And then last comment, and then I'll end with this. I think the P5 might have new opportunities for some of these mechanisms in addition to the whatever we can do in the UN and through direct negotiations. The previous administration sort of downplayed the P5 a bit. I think they worried that it was some kind of, it was getting China off the hook. The Chinese could do this sort of make believe arm control. They could agree to cooperate in building terminology and so on, but not really agree to major legal limits on their forces. Whereas I think the Biden people may want to use the P5 as a mechanism to engage China and the other nuclear powers more directly, strictly, and then the non-nuclear states who are pushing the nuclear ban treaty. So, I mean, even now, and I'll end with this, you don't see much Russia-China US cooperation, but there is a definite feeling among all three countries that trying to adopt a nuclear ban treaty is not going to work, and it's going to risk undermining the existing NPT regime if we're not careful. So this might be a near-term issue. We'll see, since we have a NPT review conference now rescheduled for next August. All right, thank you very much for allowing me to toss out some ideas. But as I said, I'm eager to hear people's questions and comments as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Richard. This was wonderful and very detailed. We do have a few questions in the chat, and I'd like to start with Mariana Skrabina, who is Dr. Mariana Skrabina, actually, and she is an energy consultant. She'd like to ask you something.
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to ask a question. I would like to cordially thank the organizers of this event, and also especially my PhD advisor, Dr. Lukin. And Dr. Weitz, thank you so much for sharing your insight and giving such a comprehensive overview of the topics of US-Russia-China cooperation. And but as a former energy as an energy consultant, as a former Gazprom employee, I'd like to ask you to elaborate on the question of US sanctions on the Russian energy sector, and how the coming of the Biden administration into power might impact Russian gas projects in China and Europe. And do you project any easing of US sanctions on the Russian energy sector? Thank you.
Right. So far, there's not been an explicit statement on that issue from the Biden team. They have made clear they will look at the question of US sanctions in general. They want to try and optimize them, not use the sanctions so much for everything, trying to figure out what's important. But with respect to the existing sanctions on Russia, including the energy sector, I think they'll probably stay in the absence of a strong reason to move them. It's just easier in the US system to apply sanctions than to remove them. We all remember the difficulty the US had in getting rid of the sanctions from the Soviet Union, even moving into Russia for several decades. And so I think they will stay. There are arguments, of course, for repeal. This is with the US and other Western countries not engaged in Russia's energy sector, particularly development in the Arctic. Russia is almost being turned to deal with China as a major source, at least for funds. But I think that I think given the opposition in Congress relaxing any sanctions on Russia presently, I think the existing ones will stay, and including on Europe, with perhaps the exception being Nord Stream. They may not want to get into fight with Chancellor Merkel on this, and they agree to put some sanctions in abeyance on that. But for the moment, I don't even see that.
Right, okay, thank you so much. Sorry, my connection dropped for a second there. Could I just ask any one of you who'd like to ask a question to put down your name in the chat window? Thank you. Now, we do have something from Sergei Trush as well, I believe. I've just unmuted you, sir.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Thank you. Thank you very much for really very detailed and systematic perspective on the topic of your talk. I know that the triangular relationship has been in the focus of your research. And let me ask you the question, can you be a little bit more specific on the EU, European Union, and probably more specifically Germany role in the competition between United States and China, notwithstanding the the shift of administrations in Washington, we believe that to this or that extent, this competition will be quite sharp, and the interests in the allies in this competition will be growing. Europe is critically a critically important area both to United States and China. So can you be a little bit more specific on EU and probably more important to Germany role in the future US-China competition? We know that Germany is the main player in EU now, especially after the Brexit. Almost half of the trade of EU with China is going with Germany. We know that Germany is still not has not made the final decision on the 5G question with Huawei, and it has certain reservations towards the pressure from Washington on this issue. We know that Angela Merkel is under the big pressure within Germany on the China relations with China. So can you, from your viewpoint, assess what would be the future Germany and in general EU role in the sharpening of US-China competition? Thank you.
Yes, good. So, but good question. So what we've seen two processes at work in the last administration. We saw growing tensions between the U.S. and key EU members, as well as the EU itself. It was no secret that President Trump didn't really like the EU and preferred to deal with the individual leaders. I think that we're going to see more of an effort to bridge those gaps, and that would I think will manifest itself in perhaps less resistance in some areas, more support for the EU in principle. On respect to Germany, you're right, it's a bit of an outlier. The Germans have taken, most of the countries have supported the U.S. position on 5G, often reluctantly, but they sort of swung into line. The Biden team has a long-term solution to this, which is to develop the U.S. 5G network, or not, if not so much the U.S., at least develop 5G in related countries. So they're going to try and work with Samsung, for example, in South Korea, and some of the European countries to develop a stronger EU 5G. The problem the U.S. faces now is that it has to ask countries to avoid dealing with Huawei, despite the fact that it's often a lower cost provider, and it can be more rapidly rolled out. So it's asking countries to take an economic hit now for the greater benefit. This argument proved successful in many countries, but Germany not yet. And the U.S. will have to decide the priority on this issue, the question of Nord Stream, question of strengthening alliance ties. How much? I think that the Biden team won't try and have it all. I think they're going to try and make a priority of what they want to achieve on these issues. But of course, the Germans themselves are going through a leadership transition, and it's not clear who, what the policies of the future will be. And any leader probably won't be as strong as Merkel, maybe more open to working with the U.S., at least initially. But Germany is definitely going to be the hardest. I think that, I think we'll see resistance in France and UK, some policies too. But as you said, Germany is the strongest, particularly regarding China. But there are common areas of support on Chinese trade practices, China's reluctance to engage in international arms control, Chinese human rights violations. So I think they'll try and drive home this area of cooperation, even as they try and change or agree to disagree on some of these other questions.
All right, thank you, Richard. Sergey, did you want to comment on that? Sorry, you'd have to unmute yourself. Still not unmuted.
Thank you. I don't have any comments. Thank you for a very extensive answer, Professor Weitz. Thank you.
All right then. Thank you so much. I believe Professor Lukin wanted to say something as well.
Well, let me ask a domestic question, because that's, I think, what's the most interesting thing now. At our last seminar, last Friday, we announced Mr. Biden to be a president, but it seems to have been a bit premature, because there was no official calling, and as you know, there are a lot of discussions about that. So I thought, well, I criticized the United States for many things, but frankly, I've been quite sure that one thing they could not do in the United States is to cheat during the voting process. But it seems now that we hear a lot about, that in some cases, like dead people voted, in some cases, some people voted twice. There will be a recount in Georgia. There's a lot of, Trump team sued in quite a few states. So I have two questions. First, how serious this is for the result? Can it be altered in a way? And second, how serious is this talk about the fraud? I mean, do people discuss it in the United States, and are they like worried about what happened? Well, thanks.
Sure. Yes, I noticed that last week's session, you talked a lot about that, the whole question, the U.S. domestic politics and polarization. Dmitry knows that very well. I know this issue less well. I try and avoid dealing with U.S., Russia, Chinese domestic politics in general. I've been surprised by domestic developments in all those countries, including the U.S. I think that most people think that President Trump will be the next, will leave office, that President elect Biden will be the new president. He has 5 million more votes than Trump, and in the Electoral College, every day they announce a new swing state that's finally gone his way. There are a lot of legal challenges, and it'll take a while to work through the courts, but there's not been, there's perhaps some evidence that some ballots were inappropriately included or not included, but it's not enough to swing the margins. I think that I think that most politicians, even in the Republican side, most of them accept that Biden will probably become president. There are these, I think, they're bearing some major revelation, which hasn't occurred. I think the process is just working itself out as each state certifies results, and that number keeps growing. And, I think that this may play in the future the same way the Democrats continue to hold up the alleged Russian interference in the 2016 elections to benefit Trump. So the Republicans will allege that the results were improper, but I think I'm not anticipating any major impact long term in terms of the what's going to happen. I think we're doomed for deadlock for the reasons that were given last week, given the partisan difference between the countries, given that President Trump, even if he leaves office, will not leave the political scene. He'll remain an important actor, pressing his colleagues not to compromise with the Democrats on some issues. If he runs again, it'll be interesting because that means that many of the people who I thought would run for president on the Republican side next year may not. I mean, you know, so like Secretary Pompeo, Nick Haley, and so on, they don't come from that Trump wing. And so if Trump's going to run again, they can't really expect to win. If he, as it looks like, sets up his own TV network, then he can continue to attack and propose his views. So I think that what will happen is this election is resolved, will be resolved soon. The Biden team will take office, and then we'll have the continued partisan struggle going forward for the next few years as people line up for the next US election. And on the Democratic side, as was discussed last week, it's not clear if Biden will run again. And I know that Dimitri felt that Kamala Harris would definitely win the Democratic standard, be the dominant Democratic nominee. I'm not so sure. They're strong Democrats. She didn't do that well in the primaries, but you know, maybe it's somewhat. It depends on how well they do in office, and if he happens to leave office before his 4 terms and she becomes president, and she'll be in a stronger position, and so on. So I think we'll probably see the same rough level of polarization we see now, but not a fundamental crisis in the U.S. political system.
Right, thank you so much. We have another interesting question from one of our co-organizers, Alexandra Bocharova.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weitz, for your lecture. I would like to ask if there is any possibility for revival of strategic triangle of Russia, US, China strategic triangle as US foreign policy during Biden administration. Thank you.
So could you elaborate a bit, the triangle, how would it shape? I mean, the triangle I see are Russia, China, strong leg, Russia, US, China, US, weak leg. That's the triangle I'm seeing. Is that what you're asking? Or?
I mean, I know that recently there is this strategy doesn't work anymore because there is no strategic balance right now in the policy of Russia, US, and China, US. But so, I mean, I wanted to ask about the strategic policy as it was like 20 years ago or even earlier. If there a possibility of revival of this like classical strategy of a triangle.
Right. So, the U.S. would love to be able to pull China and Russia apart, draw one of them on its side against the other. And people in the U.S. think tanks have been working on this question for years. If you guys have any suggestions how to do this, we would love to hear them. But there's not been a great, an obvious way to do this. So you could try and be nice to one country more than the other, and I think people thought President Trump was going to do that, try and reconcile with Russia to start to pull it away from China, or at least drive it less toward China. That didn't work because he didn't have the ability to make the kind of concessions Russia wanted to do that. China-U.S. relationship has been severely degraded in recent years. The kind of concessions that the U.S. would have to offer to win over one side or the other is improbable. I mean, dissolution of U.S. alliances or something like that, renunciation of values. I think that because of the turnover we're seeing in Washington, and you saw this even in the Trump administration, there were Russian experts who were thinking, okay, we can make a deal with Trump, but what happens if he leaves office, the Democrats come back in, or his, Mike Pence and Mike Pompeo are much more harder line. How do we ensure that any agreement sticks? So I think we're in this triangle for a while. It's going to be China, Russia, strong relationship, no clear division in the near term. I mean, longer term, you can speculate that, the rise of China, they've become much more assertive towards all their other neighbors, but Russia, how long will that Russian exception last? And if they start misstep, will that be enough to push Russia towards more balanced policy? The Russia-U.S. relationship, I say this with regret, but because I'd really like to see it improve, I just can't see anything near term that's going to improve it. I mean, I just think, and we've had 4 attempts at improving the relationship in the last few decades. They've all failed. And I don't know what it's going to take to break through that fundamental challenge. I guess the one relationship which is most up in the air is the China-U.S. relationship. Could get better, could get a lot worse. So that's probably the one where they'll see the most variation, but not in the next few years. It's more long-term. Will the U.S. and China be able to reconcile their differences? It may require a change in leadership in Russia or China for there to be a fundamental shift. I think we've seen a lot of changes in leaders in the US without much of an impact. I think that if you have a new leader in Russia or a new leader in China, they may have a different orientation. They may see more value in partnering with the US against the other. But when that will occur, if that will occur, whether a new leader would really have a different view, that's all speculative.
Okay,
thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. We have another new leader I wanted to mention. As Japan expert, there's been a leadership change there recently as well. And I was wondering, in relation to that and the change of leadership in the US, do you think the dynamics in bilateral US-Japan relations would be affected as well? Thanks.
Yeah, it's interesting because you're getting a change in leadership in Japan and in the US concurrently. We were all for years focused on this question, and there are a couple people on the call who know more about this than I do if they want to come in, about the possibility of a Russia-Japan reconciliation. There was a lot of logic for that and some initial support for that in the US. I think that it was seen in the US interest that Russia's Asian policy was become less China focused. And so it'd be good to make a reconciliation there. And from the Japanese perspective, their clear security challenge now is North Korea, and especially China. And so it doesn't make sense to be in confrontation with 4, including South Korea and Russia, other countries at the same time. It'd be better to try and reduce tensions with at least one of those to focus on the others. And we had 2 strong leaders in Tokyo and in Moscow. And so if there was going to be a territorial compromise, unlike in the past, they might have been able to sell it. They could have had some kind of division on the islands, and there'd be criticism in Russia and criticism in Japan for not taking everything, but they would be able to manage it. New leader in Japan, I'm not clear they would have that kind of capacity. The Japanese, I think, were generally comfortable with Trump. They didn't like some of his trade policies. They didn't like his abandoning TPP. They weren't happy about being asked to pay all this additional host nation support. But he stood firm with them on the question of Korean abductees. He stood firm with them against China. He supported their military reforms. I think there wouldn't be much of a change with the Biden team on those issues. Japan's main challenge is really to get its economy moving again. It's been stagnating pretty much for the last few decades, and that's allowed it to be overtaken by China. And even though we've gotten Japanese leaders are more comfortable with a greater global role, I think you've got to get a more dynamic economy there, and that's going to be difficult because of factors internal with China, Japan, the aging and unenthusiasm about immigration. So I think people are looking for some major changes in relationship under Biden, but I don't think Japan's going to be one of them.
Right, thank you so much, Richard. I may have missed some things in the chat because the connection dropped at one point, but if there isn't anyone who'd like to make a comment or ask a question, then we're going to conclude it here, I think. Richard, would you like to say a few final things, maybe that you've missed during the talk? Or
no, thank you. I had some case studies I worked out last night, but we don't have time. I'm trying to look at this relationship both functionally, so looking at arms control, military, cyber, space, and then geographically, there's some interesting developments in Central Asia, which I think we've talked about in previous seminars. And I really appreciate that you're holding these, because it allows us to hear different views on what's happening in some Eurasian countries which are not closely followed in the US. So thank you very much for the opportunity. I'd love to join similar opportunities if somebody needs a lecture or for a class or something in higher school economics or some other university, please let me know. I miss teaching. I'm being in a think tank that has some advantages, but it's a great opportunity to be able to teach some younger students if that opportunity arises. But otherwise, thank you very much for hosting me.
yeah, thank you so much for coming and for your talk. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for participating as well, and we look forward to seeing you next time as well. You'll be notified via email of our next seminar. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Спасибо за внимание. Хорошего weekend.
Thanks.